So today is government budgets. It's deficits and debt is what I actually think of it as. So we're going to first talk about the macro effect of government deficits. Then we're going to talk about the U.S. federal budget in terms of measurement issues and sort of how projections of the budget are sort of done, how the deficit projections, et cetera, are made. The end of lecture is sort of more similar to what Gruber covers at the end of the chapter. The middle is where I'll sort of spend the most time, which is sort of about net exports and interest rates and deficits and twin deficits and trade deficits. That stuff is the middle of the lecture, and that's where I'll sort of spend the most time. We'll get through the whole thing, but I do think the end is sort of something you're equally qualified to find in Gruber. I'll throw a little bit more into it when I go through it, but that's sort of the easier part, I think. Okay, so the macro effects of deficits. So, well, deficits can be used as a stabilizing tool, right? The economy has a natural business cycle. It has peaks, it has troughs, and sometimes spending during a downturn or during a recession can be used to sort of counteract the consequences of the troughs, of the slowdowns, of the recessions. So in some ways, this is an automatic policy change, or an automatically triggered set of policies in terms of automatic stabilizers. Those are things like, a policy that's already been legislated that sort of kicks in as the economy slows down. That includes policies like unemployment insurance payments, right? Those have already been put into place, and when the economy slows down and more Americans find themselves out of work, more of them apply for UI benefits and more of them receive them. That's automatic spending that's happening, right, at the federal level. It's done through the states, but it's supported through the federal government, right? That's automatic spending that's triggered by the slowdown itself, right? An automatic stabilizer. I'm not sure why that keeps happening, but I'll try to touch the keypad so it won't. So that's an automatic spending policy. It could also include things like food stamps or the social safety net, right? As the economy slows down, more people find themselves in poverty, they apply for food stamps, for welfare benefits, and they receive them. So it's additional spending or expenditure coming from the government into the economy that's slackening for whatever reason. That's due to the natural business cycle. Those are automatic stabilizers. It's also true that taxes sort of automatically fall, right? Because you only owe taxes on income, the sort of revenues being extracted from the economy slow down as the economy slows, right? We see tax revenues come down, and that's sort of another form of automatic stabilization. Yikes. So in addition to automatic stabilization, there's also discretionary policy, right? Discretionary stabilization, also known as stimulus, right? So the idea that when demand is slackening in the private economy, the government can step in and actually sort of supplant that missing demand through government expenditures, kind of the basis of Keynesian fiscal policy, right? That the government can step in and actually sort of prime the pump or start the economy on a better course. The key sort of concept behind this is the idea that each government dollar sent out has a multiplier effect. So a dollar spent fixing a bridge in Iowa will then be pocketed by sort of the bridge construction company, who will then go ahead and spend that dollar on concrete inputs and the concrete inputs and wages for laborers, right? And those inputs will then spend that money on household purchases, right? And that dollar sent out from the federal government will then go on to become $2, $3, $4 of sort of economic transaction in the broader economy. That's the multiplier effect. Those who advocate Keynesian economics believe that multiplier is greater than 1. Something is up to 3, 4, 5, right? Others who are sort of more critical of this notion that the government can prime the pump or supplant missing demand sort of speculate that maybe it's not greater than 1. Maybe somehow government spending does not really add to demand, that it somehow is undone by the private economy. An additional dollar of expenditure by the federal government is countered by a pulling back of expenditure by the private households to sort of counter the effect of the government. The idea behind that is called Ricardian equivalence, which is that sort of any measure taken by the government is undone by private households because they see any policy change by the federal government as sort of resulting in later policy change that they then sort of act to sort of protect themselves against. An example of that would be suppose the federal government spends an extra dollar, increases expenditures by $1, then households say, you know what, the government's spending an extra dollar. Eventually they're going to need to pay for that dollar spending through taxes. And so I'm going to sort of set aside $1 from my consumption in order to pay the taxes down the line. That's the sort of the idea of a Ricardian equivalence, that private households are undoing what the federal government does. Empirically, Ricardian equivalence has not really been well substantiated, right? We don't have evidence that it's really true. So it does seem that, $1 spent by the government is at least $1 of expenditure. It's not being undone. But sort of the idea that the government can step in and sort of prime the pump or supplant slackening demand is the base of Keynesian policy, and it sort of is the undergirding philosophy of acts like we saw recently, like the stimulus in 2009, right? The $787 billion stimulus was an example of sort of Keynesian fiscal policy. The key part of this, economists have wondered more in previous decades than sort of the last couple, what is the multiplier effect? How many times does a dollar spent by the government sort of go round, right? How much sort of economic output does it then trigger? And that question, used to be really hot because there was a lot of interest in sort of using fiscal policy to sort of stabilize the business cycle. And that sort of became less of an interest in economics, partly because the business cycle sort of seemed to be mitigated to some degree or seemed to be less intense for a couple decades until recently. Also partly because there was a lot of concern in economics that recoveries seemed to be shaped more like V's, right, that we come down and then we start coming up, and we come up at a pretty fast clip, so that sort of the more V-shaped the recovery is, the more important it is you time the bottom, right? Because if you start pumping money into the economy as it's already coming back, what you could actually be doing is creating inflation, right? The economy is already coming towards full capacity, and you're sort of trying to increase demand, you're trying to increase spending, and you're just bidding up the price of factors, right? That was the concern. And now, maybe we have some sort of evidence that the last couple of recessions we've seen, the recovery from the recession in 2001, as well as this recession, have been less V-shaped and more sort of J-shaped, right? Where there's this slow sort of pull-out from recession into recovery. And the more sort of flatly sloped that recovery is, the less critical timing it right is, right? Because the problem with a V-shaped recession, right, is that timing it correctly is very important, and Congress is not exactly the most nimble of sort of organizations. And the idea that Congress is going to act quickly enough to time the recovery spending or time the stimulus spending exactly right was difficult to believe. But with a slower recovery, the timing is less sort of critical, and we sort of think that there's more of a positive effect of this type of spending. Because the key part of this is that we want that this sort of Keynesian fiscal stimulus has different effects in a weak economy versus a strong one. So in a weak economy, this is, what is a weak economy? It's a recessionary environment, it's a trough. These are all sort of synonyms for an economy in which the factors of production are not fully employed. This could mean that labor is facing involuntary unemployment or underemployment, right? That workers are not able to work as many hours as they would like to. Like when they make their labor-leisure trade-off that we've already talked about, they arrive with a number of work hours that they would like to sort of supply, but there's not enough demand for them to actually get to work all those hours. So there's sort of there's labor capacity that's not being used. It's also the case that there could be excess capacity in terms of capital. That could take a couple different forms. We can imagine there being mothballed plants and factories, right? That firms might stop having full around-the-clock shifts, right? They might get rid of the graveyard shift. They might sort of be leaving the capital sort of not in use at certain times of the day, or certain factories may be mothballed. We could also imagine something like financial capital, right? Right now is a time where firms in the U.S. actually have cash on hand, right? There's a lot of cash in the coffers of U.S. corporations. That's financial capital, but they're not necessarily turning that into physical capital, right? They're not going out and actually investing. This is a concern, right? We talked about this before, that sort of capital expenditures often lead to sort of the purchase of durable goods and employ manufacturing workers. And this lack of investment in capital goods is sort of a concern in the U.S. economy. And it's another form of sort of capital not in use, right? It's another form of capital not in use. If there's spare capacity in the U.S. economy, the factors of production are not really being used to their utmost potential. So the primary goal of sort of fiscal policy in this type of environment is to actually get labor and capital back into use. There's an output gap in a weak economy between the potential output of the economy and what's actually being produced. And the goal of the policy is to shrink that gap, to sort of have the factors of production be in greater use. I do not know what's happening. I'm not sure what to do. I'll just sort of keep trying to sort of keep this from going to sleep. So the goal of policy is to sort of just reduce that gap. And in this case, a fiscal policy that leads to a budget deficit, so deficit spending, can help an economy with an output gap, right? So in two ways, actual direct spending by the government can spur demand, right? It'll put money back into it's just a form of spending. It's going to increase demand. It's going to shift demand out. Second, that's through direct expenditures by the government. That's things like fixing bridges or building an aircraft carrier or hiring teachers, right? State aid to the states all falls under this sort of category. The other form of Keynesian stimulus, right, is to simply cut taxes, to let families keep more, right, of their paychecks because they can then spend some of those dollars, right? The question as to which sort of fiscal policy instrument will be more effective, right, is just the relative multiplier. The $787 billion stimulus was not all spending, right? Parts of that were tax cuts. There was a cut in the payroll tax. There were some other tax policies like making work pay, which was sort of like a working family's tax credit. Those tax cuts versus this direct spending, which one's better? I mean, there's some philosophical sort of points to that, like some people to sort of prefer one to the other. But in terms of the effectiveness of fiscal policy, what we're really asking is how big is the relative multiplier of those two policy instruments. Each dollar of spending that the government does, right, is a dollar that's actually going to go out and become demand. If households, on the other hand, have a tendency to save a high fraction of tax cuts during a weak economy, potentially because of precautionary savings motives, as we've talked about before, or simply because there's debt overhang, they have a lot of debt. If there's some sort of feeling that households are actually going to end up saving a large fraction of their tax cuts, that could be a less effective sort of fiscal policy. Of course, households may spend on different goods than governments spend on, and the relative multipliers of those types of goods may somehow be different. But sort of these are the ways we want to think about this. We want to think about the relative multipliers of these two kinds of spending. I'm sure the natural question you want to ask me is, what is the multiplier of government expenditures during deficit periods? There's not a huge consensus about this. There's a lot of different figures, and the truth is they come out of differently studies of different quality, and also sort of studies with different techniques, and no consensus has been reached. A question researchers are recently sort of thinking about is, you know what, maybe there isn't a multiplier. It's very likely, right, that spending has a different multiplier effect in a weak versus less weak economy, right? And there's another way to sort of think about it. So I do not have an answer for you as to what the multiplier of government spending is. If we did, I think this would be a much less controversial set of policies we've undertaken. Question?
Just with regards to tax cuts,
Mm-hmm.
like, because I'm trying to get a sense of, like, if you have a payroll tax cut that's immediate, that's money in the pockets in the households right now,
Yep.
versus, like, other tax cuts where you have additional credits to claim on,
Right.
file.
There's a timing difference.
Exactly.
And there's in two ways. So first of all, the type of tax cut, the timing of it matters, right? Well, we think individuals, if we tell them you're going to get a tax cut at the end of the year, that they will go ahead and spend more of their income because they don't need to save as much for taxes, right? But that's sort of, homo economicus, right? Where everyone's rational, everyone sees through it, but there could be some behavioral sort of angle to this, where somehow more the payroll tax cut that you see, sort of less withholding or less payroll taxes, less FICA each paycheck you somehow has a different effect. That could be part of it. Also, there's the question of spending versus tax cuts. If spending takes longer to get out the door because of shovel-ready projects, somehow it takes some kind of process to get them actually going, versus people going out and actually just shopping at stores is faster in some way, there could be some sort of timing difference between these two channels as well. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, question.
Which multiplier is generally better?
It depends. This is an unclear question. I can look into it a bit more and look at sort of some of the research and get back to you. Shoot me an email if you're genuinely curious, and I'll look into it. But this is not a literature I'm super familiar with off the top of my head. But one thing that makes sort of stimulus difficult to evaluate, right, is did we get to have two American economies and provide one with a stimulus and the other one not? No, right? That when we evaluate something like a stimulus policy, what we really need to establish is what is the counterfactual. What would have happened to the U.S. economy had we not had the stimulus in 2009? And that question is sort of the entire solution, right? If we say that things would have been horrible, then the stimulus looks like a better policy, right? If we say things would have been not so bad, the stimulus looks like a less effective policy. And it's sort of trying to sort of establish what the counterfactual would have been is sort of the devil is in those details. So I think it's a difficult question by the nature of sort of macroeconomic policy in some ways to actually evaluate it. But there are some attempts to sort of look at how different policies differentially affect states and make comparisons across states. And there is a good paper by I think it's Doug Steger on the stimulus. That's interesting. On the most recent stimulus that you might want to take a look at. I can try to post a copy of it on the course website. It's an interesting take. Remember, it's a difficult question, so that's one of the reasons why some of this literature is not as fulfilling as other literatures. That's just because of the difficulty of the question. Okay. So that's in a weak economy. Let's think about government deficit spending in a strong economy, on the other hand. So let's think of an economy sort of like the late 90s, where unemployment is low, capital is being employed, everything is fine and dandy, we think things are going to be great forever. This is a situation where the resources of the economy, the people, the capital, all of that is being used to its utmost potential, right? The output gap is actually very small. The potential output of the economy is very close to what's actually being realized. This is a time where, sort of one of the goals of sort of federal spending or spending at any level should sort of be ways to sort of increase the capacity of the economy, right? Because the factors in the economy are being fully used. We're trying to do is sort of develop factors. We could think about things like policies to strengthen human capital, right? Education. Policies to sort of develop technology so capital is more productive. This is a case, though, where deficit spending could, in fact, hinder growth, right? Because the factors are so fully employed, increasing demand for either labor or capital is simply just bidding up their price, right? The price paid to labor, the price paid to capital is just going up as we sort of increase demand because there isn't really any way for output to adjust, right? So in this case, deficit spending in a very strong economy can in fact be inflationary. Because what does it mean we're increasing prices of stuff? We're creating inflation. And that's the concern. So when I was talking about how the timing is very important, right? In a V-shaped recession and recovery, timing the bottom is really important because very quickly we're getting closer and closer to full capacity. And putting the policy in place too late could actually be inflationary, right? It wouldn't have helped the economy when it was at its weakest, and will in fact be just creating inflation when it's stronger. So sort of whether deficit spending is a good or bad thing sort of just depends on the economic context. Okay, so actually is this next? Okay, so that's sort of the macro implications of deficit spending. I do want to talk about sort of the mechanics of sort of some of these channels when it comes to the effects on investment and net exports. So, okay, I'm going to go very slowly here. If I'm actually still going too fast, please just let me know, because I really want you guys to get this, to nail this, for this to be easy and simple, and I think it actually is if we go at the right pace. Okay, so the first thing we're going to start off with is simply the definition of national savings. We denote national saving with S, and S is simply total output of the economy, which is Y, less consumption by household, which is C, and less government spending, which is G. So total income minus consumption spending minus government spending is national saving. If I were to ask you what household saving is, you tell me it's sort of the income they get, less what they pay in taxes, less what they spend on consumption, right? And that's exactly what we see. That first term, Y minus C minus T, is household saving, or personal saving. If I were to ask you what government saving is, you tell me it's revenues less cost, right? Less spending. And that's simply T minus government spending, G. As you can see, all I've really done is subtracted T and added T. I've just rewritten the definition of S. National savings is simply private or household savings plus government savings, and that's national savings. When we deficit spend, when our government expenditures G outpace our tax revenue T, we're running a deficit, right? Whether or not a public deficit, right, whether a fiscal deficit leads to less national savings depends on the reaction of households. If households react to $1 of deficit spending by the government by simply saving an additional $1 in order to sort of pay the taxes that they think will come down the line, that again is called Ricardian equivalence. In that case, national savings wouldn't change, right? If for every $1 of deficit spending, households collectively save additional dollars, right, we would see no change in national spending. But like I said, Ricardian equivalence doesn't actually have a lot of empirical backing. So it does seem that every $1 of deficit spending contributes roughly $1 to the decline in national savings. Okay, it's not quite 1 for 1, but it's close. It seems to be empirically close to 1 for 1. So deficits, in effect, reduce national savings. When G is too high, S is a little lower. That's all we're really saying. Okay, so that's the definition of saving. Now let's go to the second piece, which is the national accounting identity. This is an identity. This is what I'm telling you. This is like definitional, right? I'm telling you this is a fact. Total income in the US, Y, national income, is comprised of What we spend as consumers, C. What the government spends, G. What goes into investment, I. Plus net exports. That's an identity. It always holds. No matter what's going on, no matter what the deficit is, no matter what the trade deficit is, doesn't matter, that accounting identity holds. Net exports, remember, is the difference between exports minus imports. If our exports exceed our imports, net exports is positive. If we're importing more than we're exporting, which is what we typically do, net exports is negative, and we're running what is called a trade deficit. Okay, so that's an accounting identity. Now let's put these two things together. So first let's start with our accounting identity. Suppose I moved C and G over to the left side. Then I would have Y minus C minus G equals I plus net exports, right? But what's another term for Y minus C minus G? National savings S. So putting together the definition of national savings and the national income accounting identity, or the national accounting identity, we find that national savings is simply equal to the sum of investment and net exports. In other words, suppose we have a decline in national savings, perhaps created by deficit spending. Putting these two things together tells us that a decline in national savings translates into either a decline in investment, a decline in net exports, or a decline in both, right? Such that the two sides of that equation are still equal. In other words, budget deficits have the effect of either reducing investment or reducing net exports or reducing them both a little. Okay, I'm going to stop for a second. Any questions about this? Yeah, Tal.
Just said now that national savings, a decrease in national savings result in a decrease in investment and in net exports, or both?
Yes, because the sum of net exports and investment together must decline by the same amount that savings has declined. So it could be one that's declining, it could be the other that's declining, or they could both be declining a little.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
But how do you know the causal effect could be the other way around? A decrease in investment.
Translates into a decrease in savings. Well, the mechanism is what tells us the direction. Yeah. If you don't see it after this, after a few minutes, let me know. But it's a good question. Okay, so I'm going to back up a second. I'm going to say this again. So when Congress, so the 535 guys and some women, right, mostly dudes, get together and set fiscal policy, right, which is this really complicated system of this committee, that committee, this appropriations bill, reconciliation between the House and Senate, when this whole mess comes together in some set of fiscal policies that result in an increase in the deficit or a decline in national savings, that results in a change in the way corporations invest and consumers buy things from foreign countries, domestic consumers buy things from foreign countries, and how foreign consumers buy things from our country. That's kind of insane, right? That's hard, that's crazy. That's like the stuff that happens in Washington results in like small businesses in Oklahoma choosing to invest differently. It means that people who are, Germans who are thinking about cars to buy, their decisions are somehow affected by what Congress is doing, right? That's actually kind of crazy. But the way this works, right, how does fiscal policy in Washington affect all of these people? It's through two channels, through the interest rate channel and the exchange rate channel. Movements in those two rates are what translate US fiscal policy decisions made by Congress into changes in corporate investment behavior and small business investment behavior and differences in consumer behavior here domestically and abroad. Okay, let's go to let's look at the crowding out of investment. First, I want you to think of a situation where American corporations or American businesses only draw capital from American households, right? It's as if we're a country on an island, isolated from the world. There's only one country. All capital invested comes from the US, and it's invested here in the US. Let's think of that model. So initially, there's some demand for capital, which is our downward sloping blue line, right? That's some demand for capital that comes from sort of the nature of projects that firms are undertaking, their portfolio of projects they could maybe undertake. They have some demand for capital, right? When the price of capital is very high. So on the x-axis, we have the quantity of capital. On the y-axis, we have the price of capital, also known as the interest rate. the way you can think of that downward sliding demand for capital curve is that when interest rates are very high, fewer projects have a positive net present value, right? The difference between the cash flows they'd bring in and the cost of running that project are smaller, right? Or it's positive for fewer projects when interest rates are very high. So fewer projects will be undertaken. As interest rates fall, more and more projects are sort of in the money and will be undertaken, right? So that's the sort of downward sloping demand curve we have. There's an upward sloping supply of savings curve, right? People are willing to save more at high interest rates because we assume the substitution effect outweighs the income effect. The substitution effect of higher interest rates outweighs the income effect, and people are sort of willing to save more when interest rates are higher. So we have an upward sloping supply curve. Imagine the government undertakes deficit spending. So the government is reducing national saving. That reduces the supply of saving available in the capital markets, right? And we're going to have a shift of our supply curve from the blue S1 to the red S2. We're going to have a shift in. That's going to result in a higher equilibrium interest rate. The equilibrium interest rate will go up from R1 to R2, and a lower level of capital in the economy, which will decline from K1 to K2. So if there's less capital in the economy, what happens to the return to capital here? What does this say? It's gone up, right? But if there's less capital in the economy, what's going to happen to wages? Are workers going to be more or less productive? Less, because there's less capital to work with, right? So in a way, so when the government undertakes deficit spending, it's creating a redistribution, right? From whom to whom? From workers to capital owners, right? That's a consequence of this change in the rate of return to capital and the lower level of capital. So are these just moving on their own? Is that what's happening? They're just changing, right? You know what? I'm just going to see if there's something I can do to this. I think I hit a button to make it full screen. I mean, I hit some kind of command. Maybe I did something silly. Let's see if we do it this way. Okay. So that's sort of the situation if either, one second. This is the situation if either I said, this is a country where all capital is American capital and all firms are American firms, right? We're an isolated country. We're cut off from the rest of the world. Question.
Sorry, can you just repeat that last little bit? So less capital means capital.
Yep.
And then workers, their interest rates gone up, so workers have to work less.
It's not because interest rates have gone up. It's because there's less capital in the economy. Each worker is working with less capital, so they're less productive. Just imagine if you're trying to bake cookies and you only have one cookie sheet versus two, right? You're less productive with one cookie sheet than two cookie sheets. So when each worker is working with less capital, he or she is less productive, so wages will go down. And so the effect of deficit spending is a redistribution, right, of income from workers to capital owners. Question?
Is it that the workers have only one cookie sheet instead of two, as much as that the employers only have less money to hire people, and so there can be fewer people hired?
It's the first. It comes from there's no sort of cash on hand leads to investment. None of that's in this model. It's simply a production function that combines capital and labor, right? That has diminishing marginal returns to each factor, right? The other factors, productivity will increase, but the cross product is basically positive. The way to think about it. The marginal productivity of capital increases in labor. The marginal productivity of labor increases in capital. It's a mathematical nature of the production function. Does that make sense?
Not completely, but that's
Okay, do you want to ask me after class, or? Okay. Okay, now let's think of an example of a country where it's a small country and it has access to international capital markets, right? Let's say they could borrow freely at some world interest rate, R1, right? There's access to sort of foreign creditors or foreign lenders or foreign capital, right? There's a supply curve that's actually pretty much perfectly elastic at R sub 1. In this case, sure, national savings will reduce the supply of, national deficit spending will reduce the supply of national savings. We'll shift one from S1 to S2, but the prevailing interest rate won't change, Because sure, in the domestic economy, capital holders, capital suppliers require interest rate of R sub 2, but since foreign creditors are willing to lend at R sub 1, our domestic investors, those who want to acquire capital, will actually be able to get capital at an interest rate of R sub 1, and we won't actually see an impact of deficit spending on the interest rate or the level of capital in the economy. Will remain at K sub 1. So which of these two worlds we live in is a function of how integrated our capital markets are and how small our supply of national savings is relative to the supply of international savings, right? If we're really well integrated, but we're 80% of savings, this is less true, right? But if we're a small country and there's a lot of international savings, this world is closer to reality. Okay. Okay. Now let's talk about trade deficit. So we talked about the investment side, right? So that's how, a decline in national savings can trigger a reduction in investments to the degree, that we just discussed this, right? This is this model, that we reduce savings, we increase the rate of return to capital, we reduce the amount of capital in the economy. That's how investment is going down here, right? Investment has fallen because of the decline in national savings. Now let's talk about the net exports channel. Let's talk about trade deficits. So when I say that net exports decline, what I mean is we're importing more relative to what we export, right? That's what a decline in net exports means. There is another identity, our third and final identity, which says that net exports equals net foreign investment. This means that if we're a net importer of goods, we're a net exporter of assets. What does this identity really mean? What it means is that no one gives you stuff for nothing. So we sell some stuff to other countries. We sell lots of stuff to other countries, right? But we also buy a lot of stuff from other countries. And on net, we buy more stuff from other countries than we sell to other countries. But they don't give us that stuff for free, right? When we go to the store, we have to give them cash, right? We give them currency initially, right? And that's the way in which sort of we don't get the imports for free, we pay them. So they first get sort of US currency, right? But no one really wants to hold currency, right? No one holds money under a mattress. They want to hold assets to protect themselves against inflation. They're going to hold US assets because there's a better rate of return in assets. So they're going to go ahead and use those US dollars that they get for their exports, our imports, right? They're going to take those dollars and go ahead and buy US assets. Those could be US bonds. This could be other assets in the US, right? That could be a world port, for example. It could be various things. And so when we are a net importer of goods, we must be a net exporter of assets because we must pay for those goods in some way. When we are a net importer of goods, if we're buying more stuff than we sell to foreign countries, more foreigners will own US capital, right? National income will decline because the returns to capital, right, the interest payments on those assets, will be going to the foreigners who hold them rather than Americans that would have held them had we not been net importers. And finally, this channel, right? This channel by which this is true is through the exchange rate channel. So this has happened before, right? We've seen, we are net importers. We've been net importers for a long time. Can anyone think of an example of sort of a salient or noteworthy purchase of sort of culturally significant US assets by foreign countries? Not foreign countries, but foreign investors. There's one in Midtown. Yes, and another, which is near to other things, which I'm thinking one that Mitsubishi in particular bought in the 80s. Rockefeller Center was sold to the Japanese, right? There were, in the 80s, we were sort of, we were definitely a net importer with Japan, right? We had a trade deficit with Japan. Japanese firms owned Pebble Beach. They owned other sort of favorite golf courses. And this was sort of, when Americans see foreigners owning our assets, they tend to get a little bit, nervous and they feel a little odd. There was one more recently that I mentioned, Dubai World Ports, right? This is nothing but the other side of us buying more goods from these countries than we sell them. When they own our stuff, it's because we own their product. When they own our assets, it's because we bought a lot of their products. It's simply the other end of that accounting identity. There's no sort of way to get around it, right? Okay. So how does this happen? How does a change in national savings trigger a change in consumption decisions, right? That's what I'm saying. And it's through the exchange rate channel. So what did we say is the impact of, when the US is saving less because the government is running a deficit, right? An increase in the deficit results in a decline in national savings. Interest rates go up. When interest rates are higher, foreigners see US assets as relatively more attractive than they were, right? That increase in interest rates makes US assets more attractive. Foreigners want to buy our assets to invest in them, right? But before you can buy a US asset, you have to go ahead and buy US currency. You have to buy US dollars. So in effect, demand for US dollars is going up. Suppose the supply of US dollars is fixed. What's going to happen to the price of US dollars? It's going to increase. It's going to go up. And that's all we're saying. Currency will appreciate. The price of a dollar will go up because the higher interest rates are attracting foreign investors. So the currency will appreciate. So sometimes, people are going to say things like, oh, the exchange rate falls, the exchange rate rises. I want you to talk in the language of the currency appreciates versus the currency depreciates. Because the exchange rate just depends on what ratio you're talking about, right? Suppose we're talking about the number of dollars to euros, right? So dollars to euros. When the US dollar strengthens, that ratio goes down, right? Because it takes fewer dollars to buy a euro if the US currency appreciates. Suppose I was talking about the exchange rate in the other way. Suppose it was euros to dollars, then it would go the other way. So exchange rates can get confusing when it comes to the sign. What I really want you to say is appreciate or depreciate. Appreciate means strengthen. It means the price of the dollar is going up. So when interest rates go up, in a normal world, the price of the currency goes up. The currency appreciates, gets stronger. Vasundhara?
I have a very basic question.
Yes.
How is it decided that how much dollars would go in the market? How much,
What do you mean by that?
as you said,
The supply.
yeah,
That's the Federal Reserve. That's the Federal Reserve. That's who controls the money supply. That's who determines the money supply. Other questions? Okay, so that's the net exports channel, right? Investment is reduced through an increase in the interest rates. That interest rate increase then triggers an appreciation of the currency. And when our dollars are more expensive, US products are relatively more expensive, right, compared to foreign products. So that's going to lead US consumers to demand relatively more foreign products and fewer domestic products because domestic products are relatively more expensive. Similarly, foreign consumers will sort of find US products to be more expensive and they'll opt to buy domestic non-US products, right? So this increase in the exchange rate, this appreciation of our currency will lead to a reduction in our net export position because exporting will be more difficult because our products are more expensive. Importing will be relatively more attractive. And so our net export position will deteriorate. We'll run a trade deficit. So this is where the idea of the twin deficits sort of comes from, right? This was a term you heard a lot more in the 80s and the early 90s than you do now. This idea that running fiscal deficits leads to a change in our trade deficit. But I sort of don't think of them as twins. I think of them as cousin deficits, right? Because a dollar increase in the fiscal deficit doesn't necessarily translate into a dollar increase in the trade deficit because there's another channel, right? An increase in the fiscal deficit it results in either an increase in an increase in the fiscal deficit, a reduction in national savings, either translates into a reduction in net exports, or a reduction in investment, or a reduction of each. So it's not true that an increase in the fiscal deficit goes one for one with an increase in the trade deficit because we could have a change in investment instead. Right? So that's why I don't think of them as twins. They don't move one for one. They're sort of related. They're sort of cousin deficits is the way I think of them. Okay, I'm going to stop for a second because, again, I've said a lot of stuff. Question?
Can you explain this thing again about the twin deficits, like fiscal deficit and...
So fiscal deficit means the government is deficit spending. We said that results in a decline in national savings, right? But it doesn't necessarily translate into a one-for-one decrease in net exports because it could be investment that's falling as well, right? So they move together, but not necessarily in lockstep. Okay. And a fiscal deficit affects net exports through the exchange rate channel, right? That the interest rate increase leads to an appreciation of our currency, which makes our products less attractive, which increases imports and reduces exports, and leads to a decline in net exports. Okay. So So I'm sure the next question you had for me is, well, which one of these is bigger, right? Do fiscal deficits or reductions in national savings translate more into reductions in net exports or in investment? Empirically, it seems like estimates suggest that 1/3 of the effect is via net exports. In other words, a $1 decline in national savings translates into a 67-cent decline in investment and a 33-cent decline in net exports. So it mostly falls on investment, it seems like, according to estimates. So the way there's also sort of some caveats or sort of aspects of this that are worth mentioning. If government spending is disproportionately domestic, i.e. when the US government spends money, it spends that money on things that are produced in the US disproportionately, then in that case, a spending-induced deficit is less likely to worsen the trade deficit, right? Because all that extra deficit spending, right, is buying US stuff. It's not leading to an increase in imports as much, right? And so it's less likely to worsen the trade deficit. On the other hand, tax cuts that go to households may be more likely to sort of be used to buy imported goods, right? Households tend to buy a lot of imported goods. You can imagine, especially in recessionary environments, that certain products from certain countries are more attractive, relatively more attractive. And so tax cuts lead to sort of a greater demand for imported goods. In that case, tax cuts or fiscal or deficit spending that's due to tax cuts could actually be more likely to worsen the trade deficit. And this just depends on sort of what the Keynesian stimulus is being used for, right? A government just spending it on domestically produced stuff, it's going to be less likely to worsen our net export position. If consumers are getting cash in hand, they're more likely to maybe buy imports. It could be worse for our trade deficit. But I want to emphasize that regardless of whether a reduction in national savings is translating into a reduction in net exports or a reduction in net investment or a reduction in investment, in both of these cases, national income is declining, right? In the case of investment, right, it's that the amount of capital in the economy is falling, so there's less production in the economy, so national income is falling because we have less capacity to produce. In the case of net exports, right, we're reducing the share of exported goods, so national income is declining in that sense, right? That we're importing more than we export, we're sending more of our money abroad. Does that make sense? And of course, when it comes to net exports, we're buying more stuff, right, than we're selling. We're net exporting assets, and the returns on those assets are going to foreigners. That's the way to think about that. We're sending them money when we buy stuff, yes, but they're going to then turn around with use that currency to buy U.S. assets and get the return on those investments. The foreigners will get them. Okay. Again, I'm going to stop. This is the hard part of the lecture, I think, and it's a little complicated. So really, if you have any question, I assure you someone else has it. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so let's give us quick. So in summary, the short-run impacts of budget deficits are: budget deficits will lead to a reduction in national savings, which will then lead to a reduction in investment or net exports, or both. Estimates suggest it's 1/3 net exports and 2/3 investment. Interest rates are going to increase, currency is going to get stronger. These are the channels by which investment and net exports decline. Okay, let's think about the long-term impacts. Like I said, so there's a reduction in national income, right, from this decline in investment, this decline in net exports. We know that the capital stock is going to grow more slowly, right? That reduction in investment. Suppose we have a deficit for a few years, and we have a couple years of weak investment, and we have small increases in the capital stock for a couple years. For a couple years, we have a big capital stock. For a couple years, we're investing less. It won't be, so notable. If we do this for 40 years, we'll have a much lower capital stock than others would have had, right? So there's going to be less capital, or the capital stock can grow more slowly, so the marginal product of capital will rise, the marginal product of labor will fall, and we'll see that redistribution, right, from workers to capital holders. And the last impact is that assets flow overseas. When we first are net importers, we're handing cash over, right, as we buy jeans and buy whatever, and then eventually that currency is used to buy assets. Question up front, David?
Yes, since it is a short term.
Yep.
Budget deficits would be an increase in interest rates and appreciation of the currency.
Yeah.
We haven't really seen that
In the U.S. Yeah. So we're going to talk about that towards the end of class. We'll talk about sort of why the U.S. is special a little bit towards the end of class. But we'll get there. Yeah. I'm glad you brought this up. It's a good point. Okay. So how do we deal with the national debt? right? This is a front and center issue, right? I mean, it's an election year. What else do we talk about? So if we want to deal with the debt, like if we were a household, right? If we were a family at the kitchen table and we had a debt, we were carrying debt, we'd look at each other and we'd say, well, we can spend less, we start earning more, right? So you can either spend less or bring in more revenues. So we could either sort of cut spending by the government or raise taxes, bring in more revenue. But there's a third solution, right? This is the roll the debt solution. So, we have an existing debt. We have a stockpile of debt. Remember, deficits are the year-by-year difference between revenues and spending. So each year, if we run a deficit, that accumulates in a debt, right? The debt is the sum over all previous deficits, less any payments we've made, right? Any debt we've paid off. So we owe interest on this stockpile of debt, right? We have a stockpile of debt, and we owe interest on it. The interest payment isn't trivial. We could pay that interest by, we could pay the interest, right? Or we could pay, we pay the interest. But one way we can pay the interest is to say, okay, we owe like $200 billion in interest this year. So what we'll do is find a new lender to lend us the money to pay the interest to our old lenders, right? So we're going to issue new debt to pay the interest on the old debt. We're not even talking about paying off the debt. We're talking about paying the interest on the debt. We just issue new debt. We get new debt. This doesn't sound like a good idea in some ways, right? It sounds, it sounds sort of a little bit like that guy in Popeye, right? Who's like, I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a burger today, right? And he keeps, did none of you watch Popeye? Really, how old am I, right? Like, you did, yeah. Wimpy, right? Wimpy?
Yes, but he doesn't say burger, he says hamburger. I'm glad to pay you Tuesday for hamburger.
Thank you, yes. Okay, so I'm not the only one who knows this quote. Because the day section, too, looked at me like, dude, like, where did you grow up? So there's this character. So that sort of makes it sound like that. It makes it sound like a non-credible sort of group of people who are paying the interest without their debt. But you know what? This is an entirely doable scheme. This scheme is fine as long as the following is true. As long as our economy's growth outpaces our interest rates. If that is true, if GDP is growing faster than our interest rate, then GDP growth is faster than our is larger than our interest rate, then the debt to GDP ratio will go to 0 over time. It's a definition, right? I mean, if you have a ratio of two things and one's growing by a faster rate than the other, the debt grows by rate of interest, right? If we issue no more debt, let's say we're not spending any more deficits, and our GDP is growing faster than that, we'll be fine. We're solvent. We're credit worthy. We can keep this scheme going. We don't have to raise taxes. We don't have to cut spending. We're just going to issue new debt and roll over the old debt. Does this sound like a Ponzi scheme? Sort of, right? But the key here is that, there's sort of, there's many generations of Americans, right? And there's innovation and there's population growth. There are things that a government or a country experience that households do not. And this is the difference between household finance, like the kind of decisions you make at your kitchen table, and the decisions that governments can make, right? There's several things. Like when you think about, the reason this is a sort of a different sort of budgeting issue is that countries don't, a household typically lives, right, for 50, 60 years. So there are children, and people leave bequests for their children. They plan for multiple generations. Maybe they leave large enough bequests that even their grandchildren benefit from them, right? So people do have multiple generations of planning, but a country sort of is an ongoing enterprise. It kind of lives forever for a while, to some extent. And the way to think about this is that governments make decisions that spread costs over many generations, right? One way I think of this is that when we think about paying for things, right? We had a war, right, in the 40s, World War II, that was fought by many, many Americans. Many people lost their lives in that war, right? And the idea that, like, in a household, you would think, oh, we had this huge expense and we should now pay it off. But the idea that the generation that fought that war, that lost loved ones for that war, that saw their entire economic enterprise diverted to war instead of butter and TVs and all this other fun stuff, right? They made guns, they made ships. The idea that they would then dedicate the rest of their lives to paying off that debt seems a little funny, right? That we are a multiple generation enterprise. We go on forever. They fought that war, the benefits of that spending, right, of treasure, blood, whatever, accrued to many generations of Americans, and that cost will be borne by all of us because we can access international capital markets and our own sort of domestic capital markets to smooth that debt over many, many more years as a federal government than any household can, right? It's very hard for you to walk into Chase and say, I really like a loan, and my great-grandkids will pay it off. I promise. It's not credible, right? This is the way in which sort of the budgeting decisions of households and countries are divorced, right? They are just different considerations. They go on for very different lengths of time, and governments have funding and financing options that households simply do not enjoy. So yes, does it sound like a Ponzi scheme? Kind of. It's doable, but we can't really do this, right? We can't just say, you know what, forget it, we're just going to roll over the debt, no worries. Why? Because historically this has been true. Historically, our average GDP growth rate has exceeded our average interest rate. But as the fine print in a lot of prospectuses says, right, past performance is not an indication of future performance, right? If we have some bad years, right, and we actually default, let's say we have a large-scale shock that sends the economy into a very bad recession, right, where revenues plummet, spending, we can't cut spending fast enough. We're running a big deficit. Our interest rates go up. Our debt gets big. Our GDP gets small. This is not true. For a few years, we could default, right? There's a chance because if people start looking at us and worrying about us, the lack of confidence in our ability to pay off our debt could lead to even higher interest rates, and we may not be able to actually roll over the debt eventually. And the key here is that defaulting on our debt is a really, really, really bad thing. So even if there's a small chance that this won't be true, it's not quite worth going for option 3 alone, right? We can partly roll over, we partly have to raise revenues, we have to partly cut spending, right? And sort of which of those first 2 things we want to do more of will depend on sort of median voter preferences, but we can't really go for 3 alone. It's a risky gamble. It's a very risky gamble. Countries like the US don't typically try to do it, right? We can get away with it better than anyone because, as David said, we have very low interest rates in the US. We face very low borrowing costs, but it's still a risky road to take all by itself. Okay. So, because why? What's the horrible thing that could happen to us? The hard landing, right? Developed countries don't really go through hard landings. It's not something we've really seen, but other countries have experienced them. Argentina experienced a hard landing, right? We've seen Greece sort of have some trouble lately, right? And there are other countries that are sort of making folks nervous. This is most often described. The hard landing threat is described as a sudden lack of confidence in the ability of a nation to repay its debt. I don't know why a nation is very small. I'll change it. It's not supposed to read like confidence in the ability of a nation to repay its debt. That's not how that's supposed to read. I think it's some kind of font error. I will change that. But the hard landing threat is a sudden change in the confidence of a country to pay off its debt. That something has happened that has made people think, you know what, you're less creditworthy than we thought. This could be something like a government that seems erratic, right? The ascendancy of a political group that people don't trust, right? If someone comes into power who's, if it's more easy to default on your debt if your debt is held by foreigners, right? Because they don't vote for you, or they don't live in your country. So if a lot of your debt is held by foreigners and some populist guy comes into office, super populist, not like anything we have in the US, but like truly populist, says, you know what? Screw the creditors. If there's an increase in the probability that could happen, right? That could lead to a sudden lack of confidence in your creditworthiness or in your ability to pay off your debt. So potential triggers could be the ascendancy of leaders who are likely to default, or expectations or an actual high debt to national income ratio, right? If your debt is much, much bigger than your national income, it's sort of like not having enough income for the loan you've taken out. That's all it really is, right? It's just saying that you're not really able to pay this off. Suppose the US experiences some kind of sudden shock that really leads to a very sharp decline in our national output and our GDP in a way that our trajectory doesn't even look good. This could be something like, if the Japanese nuclear disaster had been larger, right? Suppose a larger fraction of that country was suddenly radioactive. Their debt to GDP ratio probably wouldn't look as good, and it wouldn't look like it's going to get better, next year, right? That could be the kind of thing that makes expectations of default change. There's a question. Yeah.
When you say debt, is it really like payment for its interest, or is it like the principal?
Both. I mean, it's whatever we owe. It's the principal, and every year we have to pay the interest. If we decide to roll over the debt to issue new debt to pay this year's interest, that's going to accumulate into the debt.
Because that just seems like the more debt you get to pay off previous debt, you're not necessarily paying down the principal amount. It just seems like all
But as long as your economy is growing way fast, so think of it this way. Suppose we didn't do any more deficit spending. Imagine that first. No more deficit. Suppose we've done a lot of deficit spending and now we're committed to no more ever again. We're actually doing this. Suppose we have a debt. Suppose we continue to, I'll get your question right after. Suppose we just continue to roll over the interest on that principal. How is our debt going to grow? By the interest rate, right? So as long as the GDP of our country is growing faster than the rate of interest we pay on our debt, the debt to GDP ratio will eventually go to zero. Pay off the debt. Question in the back.
Sorry, this is really basic.
That's okay. No, this is the time for all of that.
But we're borrowing from the Fed or we're borrowing from
No.
internet? This is all international.
No, this is a great question. Anyone know who owns most of, people of what country own most of our debt?
United States.
The United States. It's your fellow Americans. It's bonds. It's like baby, bonds you buy people when they have a baby. It's like bond portfolios, right? Most American debt is held by Americans. 2/3 of it's held by Americans. 1/3 of it is held by foreigners. Of the foreign held debt, a lot of it is held by Japan, a lot of it's held by China, right? Those are our foreign creditors. But they don't own most of our debt. But what is really relevant is, are Americans, right now is a slightly better moment for us in this respect, but in general, are we big savers? America's not famous for its savings rate, right? Not lately, at least, not in the last few decades. So while it may be true that most of our debt is held by Americans, what really kind of matters when you think about sort of the, if you want to call it that, sort of the geopolitics of our debt, is who is buying our marginal debt. When we roll over our debt, when we issue new debt to repay our interest, or for our current deficit spending, we have to issue debt. The stock may be mostly owned by Americans. The relevant question is who's sort of buying our marginal debt. Who is buying, when we issue debt, who's buying it? Because if for some reason foreigners have different sort of views, right, of our sort of creditworthiness for whatever reason, the fraction of our marginal debt that's held by foreigners could be important. Or if we think that when foreigners are sort of net marginal sort of creditor or lender, they might have different influence on sort of I think there's a line, it's hard to argue with your banker, right? That's about the marginal debt, right? Most of our debt may be held by Americans, and we have to think about what's happening on the margin. Who's buying our marginal debt? Okay. Where were we? Was that your only question? Yeah? Okay. Okay. So that's the first part, potential triggers. We did that. So the effects of a hard landing. A hard landing is, it's not like falling off the swings. It's like falling off the swings if you're a country. It's really, really bad, right? A hard landing is Argentina. It's countries that, we never want to be. Being Argentinian would be great when it comes to lots of parts of Argentinian culture, but financially, not exactly the category you want to be in. What happens is, so people look at your debt and they say, that stuff is not going to get paid off. We don't want to buy any more of that stuff. So your asset prices fall, right? The price of your debt tumbles because there's no demand for your debt. It's going to lead to the decline of other asset prices in your economy. The stock market's going to go down. Asset prices are going to fall. That's going to lead to higher interest rates and asset yields, right? As prices go down, interest rates and yields go up, right? But because no one wants to buy your assets, right, what did we say drives currency demand? It's demand for dollars, right? If no one wants to buy your assets, demand for dollars is going to fall because no one needs dollars to buy your assets. So we're going to have this increase in interest rates, but our currency is going to depreciate, right? It's not like the normal world. This is the really bad world where things change and things are very bad. And finally, we're going to see this combination of net exports rising, right? Because our currency is depreciated, our goods are actually more competitive on the international market, right? We've gotten our currency's cheaper, our goods are relatively cheaper, people are going to want to buy our toothpaste more than they used to. And so because our net exports will rise, capital's going to flow out of our country, right? Because if we're selling more stuff than we're buying, we're going to have capital outflows. This relationship is as it ever was, right? Because this is an identity. Net exports equals net foreign investment. This is as it always was, right? This is net exports go down, assets flow out of the country, or capital flows out of the country. This relationship, this combination is what is different than the normal world. Because in the normal world, right, when we're just kind of, it's 2006, we're deficit spending like always, it's fine. What's happening is that we're reducing national savings, we're leading to an increase in interest rates, our interest rates are high, people want to invest in our assets, they have to buy dollars, our currency appreciates, net exports fall, investment falls, right? That's the normal world. This is apocalypse now, right? This is the hard landing. And the relationships are different here because what's happened is no one wants to buy our stuff anymore. No one wants to buy our assets anymore. There's been a fall in asset prices that's triggering the rest of this. Okay, does everyone see how these two worlds are different? Business as usual is one relationship between these sort of channels and categories, and hard landing, apocalypse now is a different relationship. Question, yeah. Actually, I don't know your name. Amira, yes.
Was the downgrade of the U.S. by the S&P something you would classify as that hard landing, or is that?
That's sort of us flirting with being less us business as usual and having a moment where we're like, I mean, it's not like we used to be a country that was never going to have, I mean, not never. We used to be a country that was like, no hard landing, right? That was a moment where people were like, look at that. That to GDP ratio is pretty high. And the politics, their politics does not seem entirely nimble and entirely sort of, we looked a little dysfunctional for a minute, right? The combination of things made us not, in that category, but we used to be way over there, and we took like a step closer, right? We didn't get close to even being sort of, maybe kind of, but we felt a breeze, sort of.
Hard landing would be if it was like from AAA to like C, or something like that, not.
Yeah, I mean, it would be much worse than what we saw. And especially because, I mean, also the ratings agencies did this, right? It didn't really change things very much. Like, investors didn't react to it as much as we thought, as much as they would have been for another country. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, I'm going to make sure we can go on to this now. At the end of the day, the US is a very special country, right? American exceptionalism, yes, but I mean this in a much more concrete way. We can have a worldwide financial crisis that began here, that was born in our housing markets, right? That's where this crisis came from. It was born and bred in the US, went around the world. I mean, other countries were invested in this. They didn't catch our cold. They were part of the system that was infected. But we can have it sort of based here, but still, in the height of the financial crisis, what was happening? Capital was flowing into the US, right? That's not true for countries like Argentina, right? It's because of sort of, when bad things happen, our country is the safest place to put your money, typically, right? And money comes home. So, yeah, we're a country where, there were times that people were paying to buy our assets, right? Then interest rates had become negative, or in real terms, if you factor in inflation, they were negative. And so we're a very special country. We can have, we can get downgraded by S&P and still have rock bottom interest rates, right? We can have a situation where we have spent on a stimulus in a way that no one ever has, right? I mean, really, $787 billion, and yet we can look at borrowing costs and say, you know what, it's cheaper now to fix bridges than it's been in a long time, right? This is a very special American privilege, and most countries don't get to enjoy it. It's one of the benefits. Jeff?
Whenever usually the rating agencies change the rating, the market's already anticipated that well in advance.
That's the other thing. It's not that the rating, this is a very good point, so thank you for mentioning it. It's a very good point that it's not that the downgrade didn't matter. It's that everyone knew, right? The way I think of it is it's a much more non-linear event in terms of like the news than the market's understanding of the underlying factors of that, right? Like when people were looking at, when people were deciding whether or not to buy our assets, there was no sudden revelation about our deficit picture that changed, right? That had been secret somehow, super secret, no one ever knew. Nothing like that was released, right? This was stuff everyone knew. They're like, yeah, you know what? Crazy stuff is happening on the Hill. The debt to GDP ratio is really high, but we knew that just as well before as after. So there's no, that downgrade is sort of it's symbolic. It clearly was important and newsworthy, but it's not like it's changed views relative to expectations. It clearly was a moment for us, though, right? It was a big national thing. The first time I gave this lecture, I used to talk about this like we're a country like, oh God, we never even flirt with it. We never come close. We just passed the budget resolution. We have all these sort of mechanisms to control the deficit, but it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, we just pass it well in advance. No one talks about it. It's automatically done. Sometimes late in the night, but we do it. It's never an issue. And the House really has changed this lecture. The Congress has affected the way I give this lecture. And so now you get something a little more exciting. Okay. So let's think of an optimal fiscal policy. To tax or to borrow, right? If we're not going to change spending, we want to leave spending where it is, to tax or to borrow. So When we borrow, we reduce the deadweight loss of taxation, right? The deadweight loss of taxation is that, deadweight loss is quadratic in tax rates. We need to tax smooth because of that, right? Because we don't want to have high tax rates this year and low tax rates next year. We're going to sort of have flatter tax rates. And if spending is somehow uneven, right, because we spend more in certain environments than others, for example, we have stimulus spending in recessionary environments, that's going to trigger deficit spending, right? Our interest in tax smoothing will lead to deficit spending. If we're going to not change tax rates, and we're going to spend more in some economic circumstances than others, we will run deficits. So the way to think about this is, if we were to sort of try to adjust tax rates all the time, we would trigger inefficiencies due to the quadratic increase in deadweight loss as a function of the tax rate. We need to balance the gains from tax efficiency with the losses that arise from actually running a deficit, right? And part of the way we think about this is what are we spending the money on, right? If we're running a deficit because we're throwing a lot of parades, we're not really increasing the long-term productive capacity of the economy. It's not useless. People are happier when they have parades, right? Parades are utility providing. But really, I mean, maybe you work a little bit harder when you've seen a parade the next day, the day before. So there might be some happiness effect. But really, that's not really increasing the productive capacity of the U.S. economy. On the other hand, if we're deficit spending because we're building roads, right, like we're building national highways, that's a real investment in the future productivity of the U.S. economy. If we're deficit spending because we think education increases human capital and that's productive, that's more of an investment. And so a way to think about it is that we have to think about, the tax efficiency gains and the deficit's effects are sort of mediated by why we're running deficits. $1 of deficit spending is not translated into the same sort of efficiency cost across all spending categories. It sort of depends what we're doing with the money. If we're throwing parties, less productive, right? Investing in education, investing in research, investing in technology development, investing in infrastructure, those are all deficit spending projects that are more worthwhile than sort of consumption. What do I mean by, does the government really spend lots of money on parties? No, right? I mean, there aren't large party committees in Congress, right? But there are some types of government expenditure that might be less sort of investment-oriented. Some kinds of healthcare could be like that. So healthcare and transfers to some degree are investments, right? Because we think if people are healthier, they might be more productive. But some kinds of healthcare spending, we'll talk about this more when we get to health insurance, that we sort of think some healthcare spending is wasteful. We're not getting a lot of extra health for it, but we're spending a lot of money. So that part of it is sort of like consumption, right? It could be things like, transfers also in some cases are investments, right? If we're making transfers to families with young children, sort of the extra money in the household could lead to long-term gains for those children in a way that is investment. But maybe we can think more about something like in the case of like maybe transfers that are going to sort of not non-investment consumption, right? Or if we have a tax cut, like we have the payroll tax cut, right, that's increasing the deficit right now. If people are taking their payroll tax cut dollars and buying shirts, right, that is not really increasing the long-term productive capacity of the economy. If they're taking their extra payroll tax dollars and sending their kids, or buying their kids books, that could maybe be more worthwhile, right? So tax cuts that are spent on consumption goods or transfers that are spent on consumption goods may be a less worthwhile use of deficits funding than investment type goods. Okay, so now we're going to talk about stuff that is slightly less difficult. Don't stop thinking and listening, but you can sort of worry less about things passing you by right now. It's not as stressful as it has been. Okay, so take a deep breath. So the U.S. federal budget, this is a chart that goes from 65 to 2010. Our red line is our spending. Our green line is our revenues. We are who we are, so our spending generally exceeds our revenues. There was this moment, right, in the late 90s where things were different, and then they went back to normal soon after. Okay, so when the blue line charts our net position, right, our deficit each year. So this is the year by year, right? This line charts the difference between those two lines. This is each year's deficit. If we accumulate over this thing, that will give us our debt, right? Because the debt is the stock, the deficit is the flow. The deficit is the year-by-year difference between revenues and spending, while the debt is the stockpile of deficits. So, you can see that our deficit position is influenced by several things, right? There's the business cycle, right? We have these increases in deficit, right? It gets more negative when there's a recession, when we think of parts of our history that had a trough in the business cycle. But there's also policy choices that affect our deficit, right? expansive spending, right? Spending expansions, such as during the Cold War, right? And we were sort of spending a lot of military goods. We see an increase in the deficit. When we have tax cuts, we see increases in the deficit. When we have tax hikes, we see reductions in the deficit. We also have economic expansion. So the 1990s was a time of great economic expansion, and that brought in a lot of revenues, and our deficit picture improved a lot. We'd also legislated a tax increase before that, right? In 93, we had a tax increase, and so when that boom came, right, and so income inequality also grew, that increase in tax rates at the very top translated into even more revenue, right? So all of that together sort of led to a deficit picture that was improved in the late 90s, but then we had a recession in 01, and we had some tax cuts, and we also had wars. All of that together sort of led to that decline in the early 2000s in our deficit situation. Okay, so this is the federal debt held by the public. What does that mean? It's not counting the federal debt held by Social Security. Social Security runs a sort of surplus right now, and that surplus is invested in US debt, so we're not counting that stuff. We'll get into Social Security and all its fun and interesting aspects in a future lecture, but just this is debt held by the public. That's not just the US public, it's also foreign investors. So it was really big in the 40s. That's understandable, right? Our debt was much bigger because we had a war, we fought a war. It got a lot smaller. We paid a lot of it down in the 60s and 70s. In the 80s, the debt increased again, right, because of large military expenditures combined with tax cuts in the early 80s. In the late 90s, we had surpluses that reduced our debt, as well as what's called the Cold War dividend, right? The end of the Cold War in the 1990s meant that we could spend much less on defense than we had been. So, you know, the deficit picture and the debt improved because we didn't have to spend as much on military goods. So, so that's the 90s. In the early 2000s, we see the deficits increase and the debt increases as well as we spend more, right? We're spending more on several things. From military, I mean, we fought 2 wars, so that's part of the spending. We also legislated a prescription drug act for seniors, right? That's a lot of spending. And we had some tax cuts, which led to an increase in the deficits, which accumulated into an increase in the debt. So the blue line is the CBO baseline. CBO is the Congressional Budget Office. So most people who work at the CBO are lifelong, like, econ people. They're people like me who went to work for government instead of teaching. The head of CBO is appointed by the majority party. Majority of Congress. So most people who work at CBO, nonpartisan, you know, just regular government workers, and the head of it is politically appointed. CBO, I will say, is, I mean, many parts of government that used to be less partisan have become more partisan, sort of in the last, you know, few decades. CBO is, I think, one of those places that has remained really quite untouched, right? There was politics always, but sort of everyone hates people dislike CBO, and CBO is not giving them the numbers they wish they had. Right? It's not really a political knock on them. That's how legislators feel. That's how members of Congress feel. Economists might have quibbles with CBO that are sort of intellectual, I would say. They might say, you know, they do this, they do X and Y, I'd rather they did V and Z, right? And it's sort of just choices that are both reasonable, but they make their choices, and some people are going to disagree. But I would say CBO, by and large, is very respected for not being politically motivated, for sort of supplying numbers that are the best application of CBO's modeling rules. So this is the baseline. The key to the CBO baseline is the CBO baseline assumes current law going forward. So at the end of last year, we had a compromise, right? We had a compromise that extended part of the Bush tax cuts for this year, right? And they expire at the end of 2012. So if we think about the politics, right, we know that some of those tax cuts that were kept in place, both parties sort of like, right? And some of them only one party likes. CBO assumes current law, right, in their baseline. That assumes that in 2013 they're all gone. Right? The compromise expires and all those tax cut extensions are gone. If we know the politics is that both parties like some of those policies and one party likes even more, both parties like some of them and one party likes only one party likes the rest, the outcome of that negotiation is unlikely to be they all go away. Right? That's unlikely to be the outcome of that policy negotiation going forward. But CBO assumes they all go away. Because whatever current law is the CBO baseline, regardless of what sort of expectations most people have of what policy will be going forward. So the light blue line is the CBO baseline. And we can see the deficit picture from 2010 forward is, you know, not great, but the debt does seem to be getting smaller, right? Because a lot of those Bush tax cuts expire is part of that. The dark blue line assumes the continuation of some current policies. including parts of the tax cut compromise, including, importantly, the AMT patch, right? So we talked about this a little bit that, because the tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 reduced taxes according to the regular schedule, but left the alternative minimum tax untouched, and you pay the greater tax bill between the two systems. The tax cut on this side leads to more families having to pay the AMT, right? But to protect middle-class families from paying the AMT, every year Congress passes this patch, where they sort of make people not have to pay the AMT. They just get to enjoy the tax cuts of the regular system, right? So it's very hard to believe that we would stop passing those patches, right? We've patched one every year since those tax cuts. It's very hard to imagine in 2013 we're going to wake up and say, you know what, pay the AMT, right? Hard to believe. We're not going to do it. So that's something that the CBO baseline is going to assume that there's no patch. The blue line also assumes that the AMT patch is passed every year, right? So the dark blue section sort of assumes current policies that many people that are being debated, right? So the CBO is providing some information as to what the debt outlook would be if those current policies were continued. It's not going to do ludicrous ones, right, that have nothing to do with the future, right? But things that people are debating or people consider likely to be continued would be baked into the current policy estimate. If you look at the Tax Policy Center's website, which I'm sure all of you have spent extensive time digging through, right, with your friends and family, you'll find that they have two baselines, current policy and current law, and it's the same difference. Okay. And in the footnotes here, it describes what the current policies that CBO is assuming are continued in the dark blue area. Okay, so when we talk, when CBO comes out with these numbers, you'll hear Brian Williams or whoever say on the national news that the deficit is projected to be X, or if OMB, for example, comes out with numbers, the deficit is expected to be X, the national debt will be Y, right? Those numbers are always nominal. They say them in today's dollars. So one thing we have to think about when we say when we answer the question, how big is the debt or the deficit? So these are sort of measurement issues when we're answering the question, how big is the debt or deficit? First question is, are we factoring in inflation? Right? Because suppose I've borrowed $100 from you this year, and I'm going to pay you back at the end of this year. I'm going to give you $103. So you've charged me 3% interest. Suppose inflation has gone up by 4%. Is that $103 really going to make you whole? No, right? You're net losing money in that circumstance. And so in one sense, when we have inflation, we're actually reducing the value of our debt because we're going to pay the debt back in nominal dollars. The more inflation there is, sort of the cheaper the debt is to pay off, right? So when we think about, there's an interest payment on the debt, but there's also an inflation tax on the debt. If we've run up inflation, if we've had a lot of inflation, our debt is worth less. So it's easier for us to pay it off. So I'm sure many of you are wondering, well, why don't we just increase inflation? We can pay off the debt really easily. We'll have a lot of inflation. Our debt won't be worth much. It'll be super simple. It'll be great. I'm going to run for president. It's going to be awesome. So the problem with that plan, right, with that platform is that if you have this habit, because it's not like this, when you lend me $100 and I give you $103 and we're surprised that inflation is 4%, we neither of us maybe knew that was going to happen, right? It was sort of a fair bet that 3% would be fine. But if I have the ability to control inflation, that's a really bad deal for you to make with me, right? If I say, well, okay, I'll pay you back $103 and I increase inflation to 8%, it's really not. Next year when I want to borrow from you, you're going to say, forget it, right? You have this habit of writing down your debt through inflation. And that is the consequence, right? You can't really do this. No one wants to lend to you again if you've undermined the value of your debt by increasing inflation. We've had countries do this. Can anyone think of an example of a country that used inflation to devalue its debt? I'm thinking of a much more notable example. A country that had tons and tons of debt. Germany. After World War I, had a lot of debt for reparations. They had hyperinflation, and that eroded the value of their debt, right? Okay, so that's the first issue is we have to think about inflation. The other measurement issue is, what about the assets and liabilities the government holds? Suppose we had a company. We had a company that had $200 million in cash. Suppose they took $100 million of that cash and went out and bought buildings in New York City. And they bought $100 million worth of buildings. Those buildings are worth $100 million. What would be the value of the assets of that firm after the purchase? Still $200 million, right? Because they used to have $200 million in cash, and now they have $100 million in cash and $100 million in buildings that are still worth $200 million. The US government buys capital goods, right? We buy aircraft carriers, right? An aircraft carrier isn't worth nothing. but we pretend it is when we count the deficit, right? If we've purchased aircraft carriers with our deficit spending, we still count that the same as if we purchased parties. So there is this missing asset and liability piece to this, right? That we don't count all the assets of the US government when we think about the fiscal position of the country. This has real consequences. So in 1997, the first year the federal budget was balanced, the first year in recent years that it was balanced, it was done through, yes, spending cuts and tax increases and various things. It was also done through the sale of US assets, of federal assets. One of the things that was sold was US spectrum. It was a spectrum auction. Spectrum is something, once you sell it, it's sold. You don't own it. We had a reduction in our asset holdings as a country, and we just counted the revenue as if we hadn't lost an asset. We sold a huge oil field in Southern California that the federal government had held since President Taft's administration. We sold it, counted it as revenue, right? Did not deduct the loss of the asset. There's no sort of net asset value for the US government. We're just cash flow accounting. It seems silly in some ways, right, that we value these aircraft carriers and these, various things that we own at zero. The reason, one reason we do that is that it's hard, right? What is an aircraft carrier worth?
What someone pays for it.
Exactly, what would someone pay for it? So we're going to go around and ask other countries, we do mothballing, we do sell aircraft carriers. But maybe with some goods there is a market for it, right? But we'd have to go actually do this valuation every year, right? And across all the goods that the US owns, all the capital goods, you can imagine revaluing our assets could become a source of shenanigans, right? And countries that have tried to do capital budgeting, it's called capital counting, most of them have turned back. Some countries still do it, but this is one of the reasons we do it. It's just hard. It's hard, it's complicated, and it just leads to disagreement. It's another thing to sort of fight and argue about the shenanigans of. Okay, the second issue with our measurements is we think about the spending versus revenues of this year. We think about a 5-year window, we think about a 10-year window. So 10 years is sort of the budgetary window we use. That 10-year period was chosen because sort of having a very short window encourages shenanigans, right, where a lot of the costs are outside of the window. And the shorter the window, the easier it is to move the cost outside of the window, right? So a short window is susceptible to shenanigans. But the longer the window, the more uncertainty there is about the out years, right? It's harder to get it right in the out years. And so 10 years is sort of the compromise of that trade-off. But there are other ways to think about this, right? One way we can, so right now, we have a deficit of X, we have a debt of Y. But we owe a lot of money to people, we have to pay them. We call that sort of, those payments, Social Security and Medicare, right? We've promised to pay these people money when they get old. We've collected some tax revenue from them. We've counted the revenue, haven't counted the cost. So we have these huge implicit expenses out there, but they don't show up in the 10-year window because, these people get old later than that. There are implicit obligations out there. So one way we could measure the deficit or debt is actually take those implicit obligations into account. We could also do something called generational accounting, which is the difference between what each generation of Americans will pay in taxes versus receive in benefits. The current old are doing pretty well, right? If you're 70 years old, you're a net winner right now. If you're like 15, given our current laws, you will pay much more in taxes over your lifetime than you will receive in benefits. So generational accounting is a way to illustrate the commitments of the US government in terms of spending and the tax revenue it's committed to raising and how that differs across different age groups, right? It's one way to do it. Another thing we do is just think about the cumulative long-run fiscal imbalance. So that's the difference between what we've promised to pay out in the long run versus what we're going to take in tax revenue in the long run. PDV those two, net them, and that's our net fiscal imbalance. That's the thing that scares us, right? That's the $102 trillion thing. And that's the thing that people worry a lot about, right? Of that $102 trillion, roughly $89 trillion is Medicare. This is why Doug Holtz-Aiken says, Social Security is Grenada. It's Medicare that's Vietnam, right? That's the real source of long-run fiscal imbalance. What's really interesting is we spend a lot of time as a country, or at least our politics spends a lot of time debating the merits of non-entitlement spending. It's not that that stuff is zero. But the real truth of it, when it comes to our long-term fiscal imbalance, it's really our entitlement programs that are the source of long-term fiscal imbalance. Whether we build this bridge, or whether we, tax capital gains at 50% or 28%, or say 35% versus 28%, that stuff is small potatoes. It's the imbalance between what we've promised people in terms of medical care versus what we're asking them to pay during their working lives that is the source of fiscal imbalance. It's really not the stuff we are. People say, oh, we should talk about entitlements, We should only be talking about entitlements, right? If this was our concern, that's what we'd spend our time on. Okay, and the last two measurement issues are there's this debate about static versus dynamic scoring. The dynamic score takes into account the ways in which changes in fiscal policy affect economic growth. The way a tax cut would change the size of the economic pie. I.e., if we cut ordinary income tax rates, we could see more labor supply, we could see more output, and we'd have a bigger base to tax. Right? That's what it's leaving out. It includes, the static estimate includes stuff like if we increase the child care tax credit, more people will use it, more people will spend more on child care. That stuff is included. What's not included is in the way fiscal policy affects the size of the economic pie. So, this is a big debate, and those who advocate for tax cuts are more interested in moving to a dynamic score because they think that those tax cuts do have these growth consequences. Right? This is a very hotly debated idea. When they say, folks who believe, they say, we know that these policies have some effect on growth. We'd like CBO to go ahead and do this. We'd like a dynamic score. CBO kind of countered, people countered and said, though, we have a lot of uncertainty about what the actual impact of these policies is on growth. We really have there's so much uncertainty about it. And I think a very reasonable argument that those who argue for dynamic scoring countered with is, okay, so you're super uncertain, but you've gone with 0. Why 0? Right? Why not something else too? And so in 2003, actually, CBO put out a dynamic and a static score, and we'll get to that at the end of lecture. The last measurement issue people talk about is cyclical fluctuations. So when we talk about the deficit, right, deficits are big during recessions, but that doesn't necessarily mean our fiscal policies are bad, right? That we need to correct our fiscal policies. What we want to adjust for the fact that our fiscal situation is affected by the business cycle in this way that is not our policies, but it's just the natural volatility of the cycle. And one way we reflect that difference is by cyclically adjusting the deficit measure. Okay, so the black line is the actual deficit each year. It's the difference between revenues and spending in each year. The purple line, I guess violet, maybe maroon, is cyclically adjusted. That takes out the effect of recessions and booms from the deficit picture. What I mean by that is suppose the deficit is $200 billion this year. If we think 40 billion of that is due to the fact that the economy is not at full capacity, we would say that the deficit is only $160 billion this year. We've cyclically adjusted it for the business cycle. And then there's another step CBO does, which I don't care for you to know all the details of really, which is called standardizing it, which takes out the impact of some other policies or some other changes in the economy, right? So if there's some aging or whatever, they're going to standardize it. That's another adjustment they make. What I really want you to know is about cyclical versus non-cyclical deficits. Okay, so let's go back to, so the CBO is this thing I talk a lot about because, first of all, their numbers govern Congress, right? When CBO says this policy is going to cost X, that hurts, that really has an impact on the shape of the proposal. So one thing we see is that legislators actually ask CBO for pre-scores. They want scores really early while they're forming the policy so that they can tailor the policy so that it hits a number target, right? That it costs only X or costs only X is what they're really worried about. So this is a very important part of our legislative process. It's also a terrific place to work. I had a student my first year here who went on to work at CBO, and she seems very, very happy with the work. She seems to find it interesting and exciting. I think it's challenging, but I think it's very rewarding, and people tend to really like the work. So if you're interested in if you're interested in being a policy analyst, you want to work on things that, on federal policy, CBO is a terrific place to be. Okay. So each year CBO prepares the budget and economic outlook of the U.S. Hotly anticipated, eagerly awaited. It contains the baseline projection of revenues, outlays, deficits, and the debt over the next 10 years. Remember, 10 years is a number settled on taking both the benefits and costs of a long or short window into account. The assumptions underlying the baseline, they assume current law is what governs fiscal policy, right? That if something is scheduled to expire, it expires in the baseline in that year. It accounts for projected economic conditions, so CBO does a projection of what economic growth is going to be in the 10-year window, what inflation will be in that 10-year window, what unemployment will be, what interest rates will be. So there's a macro projection underlying this forecast. This projection. And it accounts for some demographic condition changes. So it accounts for aging. It doesn't account for others like population growth. This is the category in which I say, people could look at this and say, well, why, if we know the population is going to grow, why wouldn't you put that in? That's what I mean by economists have quibbles with CBO. It's not that people think it's politically motivated. It's not like, oh, you know what, they're in the tank for so-and-so. No. It's just their intellectual disagreements as to what you would include and not include, right? You could see it being reasonable both ways. And there's some people find what they do reasonable, some people wish they did things slightly differently, but it's really an intellectual disagreement, not an accusation of sort of partisanship or shenanigans. Okay, so let's take a look at the baseline projection for 2012 through 2021. So our dark blue line is revenues. Our light blue line is, our dark blue line is outlays. Our light blue line is revenues. Yeah, I mean, outlays are always bigger than revenues for us, right? So we have the historical numbers, which are prior to the end of the fourth quarter of 2011. And then we have our projections. So you can see that there's a sharp turnaround, right? We have revenues coming back because the recession starts to end, right? It starts to ebb, so revenues increase. We also have outlays sort of coming down from this very high point that they were at as the stimulus sort of runs out, right? That's the projection. This is our deficit or surplus. This is historically in CBO's baseline with the continuation of certain policies. So this is CBO's baseline for all these years. Prior to the fourth quarter of 2011, it was the actual deficit each year. This is adjusted in the ways that we discussed. And then for the projection, the dark blue solid line is the baseline, which assumes current law, right? We have our dotted light blue line, which is the continuation of certain policies. These are policies that are being hotly debated, for example, so that CBO can provide some information as to, you know, if this debate is ongoing, if we actually stuck to policy as it is today, what would our deficit outlook be? As we can see, it would be worse, right? The expiration of some of these policies would lead to more revenues because they're mostly tax cuts and expenditures of various kinds. Okay. So this is, you know, when you look at this, I was just tempted, right? I misspoke a minute ago and said, well, the forecast. It's not a forecast, it's a projection. Because I think of what CBO is providing as a choose-your-own-adventure guide, right? It's not telling you what's going to happen. Yeah. It's not telling you what's going to happen. It's going to tell you what could happen if you did the following. Did you guys read choose-your-own-adventure books? Really, just the one? I mean, how old are you? Like, are you like secretly 14 and I don't know? So some of you did. So choose your own adventure books, you sort of, you know, as you read it, you decide whether you want to go to, you know, you want to go attack the bear, so you flip to page 49. If you want to hide from the bear, you flip to page 46, right? You end up with a different story. So I feel like CBO is sort of providing a choose your own adventure book, right? If you want to go with current policies, this is what we project your deficit will be. If you want to let stuff expire, this is what we project your deficit will be. We're not telling you what the most likely we're not giving you our best guess of what the deficit will be in 2018. Because our best guess, right, if we were to sit together and try to come up with our best guess, we would figure out what the percentage, the probability of different policy outcomes is, what the probabilities of different policy outcomes are, right? And we'd factor that in. They're not going down that route. They're not guessing what policy is going to be. They're telling you what would happen if it was X. So it's not really a forecast. It's not intended to forecast future budgetary outcomes. They serve as a neutral benchmark. What they're doing is saying, all you legislators are going to fight and argue about this stuff. We would like to equip you with some numbers that we think of as above the board, right? That people accept as the numbers, as the values of these different projects, of these different proposals. And that way this debate can be informed, right, with empirics, with some numbers. Some economists do criticize the baseline. The most controversial is that assumption of current law, right? That it's an extreme view, that things will expire as we're scheduled them to expire, even though we assume that legislation will change. Again, these are not accusations of political bias. Most people think CBO is doing a great job when it comes to politics of staying nonpartisan. It's just more quibbles with sort of methodological decisions. So what parts of the continuation of current law assumptions are most controversial? Well, it's a few things. One is that CBO is currently assuming that at the end of 2012, all the Bush tax cuts will expire, will go away, even the ones both parties really kind of both like, right? It's hard to imagine that those will go away, but the baseline assumes that it will. The baseline assumes that no aspects of the stimulus will be extended. The Making Work Pay credit, which affects sort of working low-income families, is popular. It's a very popular tax credit. Lots of people in both parties are pushing for it. It's hard to expect that. It's hard to imagine that it will really fully go away. Maybe it's smaller, maybe it's different, but zero, again. And finally, the AMT patch, right? That we're not going to have the AMT patch is again hard to believe. These assumptions are all made to, so another criticism is the current law, right? Part of sort of the way current law works is we pass laws that are only affect for so many years, and mostly tax cuts or expenditure programs, and then if we assume they go away, it's not just that we're assuming things are as they're legislated to be right now. all of these assumptions lead to a deficit picture that is rosier than we would guess it's going to be, right? It's also sort of, it's not that they're partisan, it's just that when you make decisions this way, a lot of the stuff that's going to expire is stuff that's costing us money or costing us revenue in some sense. And so we're cumulatively leading to a better deficit picture than we're likely to actually have. Okay, so this room is just nuts today, right? Something is beeping, something like this is not a normal day. Okay, so CBO projections versus actual. So our solid line is the actual surplus or deficit in each year. Our dotted line is the projection X years out. I can't remember what X is. I think it's 3 years, but or the prior year. But with the same, so the 94, let's just imagine that the 94 projection is made in 93. The 91 projection is made in 1990. So the projection interval is the same across these points. We can see that CBO not really giving us a forecast, right? I mean, if this was a forecast, this would be a crummy one, right? These two lines are not very well coordinated. But what really drives these differences is legislation. We changed policy. CBO is a baseline that assumes current law, and we changed laws, and things are different. No one saw the Medicare prescription. The Medicare Prescription Drug Act was not on the books until it was passed, right? That's going to lead to a change, a difference between the projection and the actual. It's just legislation that's driving these differences. Maybe here and there, of course, when they're projecting growth and they're projecting inflation, they're not getting that 100% right. They're off to some degree. I mean, CBO, there are shocks that hit the economy. They didn't see the financial crisis coming, right? There are shocks, absolutely. But most of these differences are driven by policy, by legislative changes. Okay, let's talk about the Bush tax cuts. So like I said, there was this big debate. Some people thought that CBO really should provide a dynamic score. CBO said, well, there's a lot of uncertainty as to what the dynamic effects are. The first group countered, well, then why, if you're so uncertain, why did you pick 0? That seems like an extreme view. CBO, said, you know what? Okay, we're going to put out a dynamic score. For the 2003 tax cuts, we're going to put out a dynamic score. We're going to take the impact of the tax cuts on economic growth into account and put out numbers that are a dynamic score in addition to our normal static score, right? And I think a lot of folks thought that, the Laffer curve effect would play out here. That sort of the fact that we were cutting ordinary income tax rates and investment tax rates would lead to more saving, more working, and we'd have a bigger economy and thus a bigger base that we'd be applying those lower tax rates to, and that those tax cuts would partly pay for themselves in that sense, right? Not fully, but partly, right? That the growth in the base, the growth in the economy, would offset some of the revenue cost. It turned out, because these tax cuts were not combined with spending decreases, right? That these tax cuts fully added on to the deficit. Through the channels we talked about earlier, the reduction in investment and the deterioration of net exports, the drag on the economy from the deficit increase was actually bigger than the growth impact, than the positive growth impact. And so on net, the dynamic score actually suggests that these tax cuts cost even more than the static estimate suggested. So, I mean, the first group got their dynamic score. They didn't love their dynamic score, right? So this was an example. And, in the first lecture today, someone asked me whether CBO is headed by a Republican or Democrat when this came out. And I honestly couldn't remember. And someone helped me by reminding me that Republicans controlled Congress in 2003 when this was being debated. I wouldn't have been able to get. I wouldn't be able to tell you with certainty. The fact that they sort of agreed to put out a dynamic score, I think if CBO had been led by a Democrat, it would have been similar. If a Republican would have been similar. Because there's sort of, there had been a prior tax act. There was a lot of interest in getting a dynamic score. Treasury was doing some stuff with the dynamic score. For CBO to remain relevant, they want to supply useful things. And if people found a dynamic score in addition to their static score to be useful, CBO, the partisanship of the leader of CBO would honestly not inform my decision, my guess as to whether or not they would have made that decision. I think a Democrat would have made it just as much. Because I think the most relevant thing to CBO, often when Congress changes party and we get a new CBO director, I think a lot of economists, when that person's appointed, says, I didn't know he was a Republican, or I didn't know he was a Democrat, right? You're not picking a talking head, typically. You're not picking the guy who's coming out and defending the tax policies of the president or of the other party's nominee, right? That's not the guy you pick. You pick someone who's sort of thought to be an economist first, and their partisanship is very much down on the list. And so, I would say that this same decision would have been made by a leader of either party. So again, I really think CBO is a place that people really do have respect for in terms of its sort of numbers first politics, not even part of it.